The Duke stood alone in the great hall as his wife's screams echoed through Ravenshire Castle, begging him not to do this, swearing the child was his. He didn't look back. Outside, the storm raged like the end of the world, and Cedric Ravenshire ordered his guards to throw Lady Vivien into it, pregnant, broken, and accused of a sin she never committed. He believed he was executing justice. He had no idea he was destroying the only person who would ever love the monster he truly was. What happened next would haunt him until his last breath, and the woman who survived that night would become the one thing he could never reclaim. Stay with me. This is where power, pride, and the cruelest kind of love collide. Book it. Cedric Ravenshire was not a man who questioned himself. He had been raised in the cold stone halls of one of England's oldest dukedoms, taught from childhood that doubt was weakness and sentiment was a luxury reserved for those without power. His father had drilled into him a single truth: a duke controls everything in his domain, or he controls nothing at all. Cedric had taken that lesson to heart. By the age of 32, he commanded one of the wealthiest estates in the kingdom, held influence over a dozen lesser lords, and answered to no one except the crown itself. He was respected, feared, untouchable. And then Vivienne told him she was pregnant. It should have been a moment of triumph, an heir, a son to carry the Ravenshire name forward into the next century. But the letter had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by a rider who disappeared into the night before anyone could question him. The handwriting was unmistakable. Lord Ashford, one of Cedric's closest allies in Parliament. The words inside were worse. Your Grace, it pains me to inform you of rumors circulating among certain circles. Lady Vivien has been seen in the company of Captain Jonathan Hale on multiple occasions during your absence last spring. I do not make this accusation lightly, but as your friend, I must warn you. The child she carries may not be yours. Cedric had read the letter a dozen times, each pass burning the words deeper into his mind. He didn't want to believe it. Vivienne had always been quiet, composed, dutiful. She wasn't the type to betray him, but the more he thought about it, the more the cracks appeared. She had been distant lately, reserved. And yes, Captain Hale had been stationed near Ravenshire during that spring campaign. The coincidence was too perfect. Then came the second letter. This one arrived the morning Vivienne told him about the pregnancy. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was elegant, feminine. Inside was a single line. She whispered his name in her sleep. Cedric had crumpled the paper in his fist and stared at his wife across the breakfast table. She was smiling, her hands folded over her still flat stomach, her eyes bright with something he hadn't seen in months. Hope. And all he felt was rage. He didn't confront her immediately. Cedric was too calculating for that. Instead, he watched her. He noted the way she glanced toward the window when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she startled when he entered a room unexpectedly. Guilty behavior. Or so he told himself. He summoned Captain Hale's service records and discovered the man had been granted leave twice during that spring, both times overlapping with Cedric's trips to London. It was circumstantial. It was flimsy. It was enough. The night he made his decision, snow was already falling. The servants whispered that it would be the worst storm in 20 years, that the roads would be impassable by morning. Cedric didn't care. He had summoned Vivienne to the Great Hall, the vast chamber where his ancestors had held court for 3 centuries. The room was freezing despite the roaring fire, the stone walls absorbing cold like a tomb. Vivienne entered wearing a simple gray dress, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked small against the towering portraits of dead Ravenshires, her dark hair pulled back in a braid that made her seem younger than her 26 years. When she saw his face, she stopped walking. "Tell me the truth," Cedric said. His voice was low, controlled. "About what?" "The child." "Whose is it?" Vivienne blinked, confusion flickering across her face. Then her eyes widened. "Yours. Cedric, it's yours. What are you—" "Don't lie to me." He stepped closer, and she took an instinctive step back. "I know about Hale." "Captain Hale?" Vivienne's voice cracked. "What does he have to do with—" "You were seen with him, multiple times, while I was away. He was delivering dispatches from the front." Vivienne's hands trembled as she reached toward him. "Cedric, I don't know what you've heard, but it's not true. I swear to you, I've never—" "Then explain the letters." "What letters?" Cedric pulled them from his coat and threw them at her feet. She stared down at the crumpled pages, her face pale. When she looked back up at him, there were tears in her eyes. I don't know what these are. I've never seen them before. Please, you have to believe me. I would never... You would never what? He was shouting now, his voice echoing off the stone. Betray me! Lie to me? Carry another man's bastard and expect me to raise it as my own? Vivienne flinched as if he'd struck her. This is insane. These letters. Someone is trying to turn you against me. Can't you see that? What I see is a wife who can't look me in the eye. What I see is evidence. Evidence? She laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. These are pieces of paper, Cedric. Anyone could have written them. You don't even know... I know enough. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, hard enough to bruise. You will leave this house tonight. You will take nothing but the clothes on your back. And if you ever attempt to return, I will have you arrested for adultery and thrown into a cell until that bastard is born. After that, I don't care what happens to you. Vivienne stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find words. Then she whispered, You're going to kill us. That's not my problem. She wrenched her arm free and stumbled backward, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. Cedric, please, I'm begging you. Don't do this. The storm. Get out! The baby is yours. Get out! His roar silenced her. For a moment they stood there in the firelight, two people who had once spoken vows in a chapel filled with roses, who had danced at their wedding while an orchestra played, who had shared a bed and whispered promises in the dark. Now they were strangers. Worse than strangers. Enemies. Cedric turned his back on her and gestured to the guards stationed by the door. Remove her from the estate. Immediately. The guards hesitated. One of them, a young man named Thomas, who had served the family for years, stepped forward. Your Grace, the roads are... I gave you an order. Thomas glanced at Vivienne, who was now sobbing openly, her shoulders shaking. Then he lowered his head and nodded. As you wish, my lord. Vivienne tried to run. She made it 3 steps before the guards caught her, their hands gentle but unyielding as they pulled her toward the door. She screamed Cedric's name over and over, her voice raw and desperate. She begged him to listen, to wait, to just stop and think. He didn't turn around. The last thing he heard before the heavy doors slammed shut was her voice, broken and hoarse. You'll regret this. One day you'll know the truth, and you'll regret this for the rest of your life. Cedric stood alone in the great hall, staring into the fire. Outside, he heard the wind howling, heard the faint sound of Vivienne's cries disappearing into the storm. He told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself she deserved this. He told himself the truth didn't matter because the appearance of betrayal was enough to destroy a duke's reputation, and reputation was everything. He didn't know he was wrong about all of it. By morning, Vivienne Ashcombe would be presumed dead, her body lost somewhere in the snowdrifts that buried the road between Ravenshire and the village. Keys. And Cedric would spend the next 4 years trying to convince himself he didn't care. But tonight, as he stood in the great hall and listened to the storm devour his wife's screams, a small, cold voice in the back of his mind whispered something he would spend the rest of his life trying to silence. What if she was telling the truth? The storm swallowed Vivienne whole. She had made it perhaps 100 yards from the castle gates before her legs gave out. The guards had escorted her to the edge of the estate and then stopped, unwilling to follow Cedric's order all the way to murder. One of them, Thomas, the young one, had pressed a wool cloak into her hands and whispered, I'm sorry, my lady. Then they had turned and walked back toward the lights of Ravenshire, leaving her alone in the snow. Vivienne tried to keep moving. She wrapped the cloak around herself and stumbled forward, her thin slippers already soaked through, her dress clinging to her legs like ice. The road was invisible beneath the drifts, and the wind tore at her hair, her skin, her lungs. Every breath felt like swallowing glass. She didn't know where she was going. The village was 3 miles south, but she had no idea which direction that was anymore. The world was white and black and howling, and she was so cold she couldn't feel her hands. She thought about the baby, the tiny life growing inside her, the child Cedric had condemned to die alongside her. She pressed her hand to her stomach and kept walking, even as her vision blurred and her knees buckled. She would not let her child die in the snow because of a man's pride. But the storm didn't care about her will to survive. Vivienne collapsed near a stand of bare trees, her body folding into the snow like a puppet with cut strings. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't obey. The cold was inside her now, deeper than skin, deeper than bone. She curled onto her side and pulled the cloak over her head, and for a moment she thought she heard her mother's voice singing a lullaby from her childhood. She closed her eyes. This is how it ends, she thought. Not in a grand tragedy, not in a blaze of defiance. Just a woman freezing to death on a forgotten road because the man she loved believed lies more than he believed her. Then she heard hoofbeats. At first she thought she was hallucinating. The sound was muffled by the wind, distant and rhythmic, but it grew louder, closer, until she felt the vibrations in the ground beneath her cheek. She tried to open her eyes, but the cold had sealed them shut. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone. A hand touched her shoulder. "Jesus Christ," a man's voice said. "She's alive." Vivienne felt herself being lifted, felt warmth that was almost painful against her frozen skin. She wanted to fight, to demand who was touching her, but her body refused to respond. She was carried through the snow, heard the creak of a carriage door, felt herself being laid on something soft. A blanket was wrapped around her, then another, then a third. Someone was rubbing her hands, her feet, trying to force blood back into her limbs. "Who is she?" another voice asked. "I don't know, but she's pregnant. Look at her. Christ, what kind of bastard leaves a pregnant woman in a storm like this?" Vivienne forced her eyes open. The world was blurry, lit by the flickering glow of a carriage lantern. She saw two men leaning over her, both dressed in fine traveling cloaks. One of them was older, with gray at his temples and sharp, intelligent eyes. The other was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from marble. The younger man met her gaze, and Vivienne saw something unexpected in his expression. Recognition. "No," he said quietly. "Not recognition. Realization. You're Lady Ravenshire, aren't you?" Vivienne tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. The younger man leaned closer, his hand still gripping hers. "My name is Adrian Blackthorne. I'm the Crown Prince of England, and I'm going to make sure you survive this." Vivienne stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. The Crown Prince. The man the entire kingdom whispered about, the brilliant, ruthless heir who had once executed 3 corrupt lords in a single day and dared Parliament to challenge him. The man her husband had called the most dangerous person in England. He was saving her life. "Why?" she whispered. "Because," Adrian said, his voice cold and precise, "I don't believe in letting people die for someone else's stupidity. And because I have a very strong suspicion that the Duke of Ravenshire just made the worst mistake of his life." Vivienne's vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't from the cold. It was from tears. She felt the carriage begin to move, heard the crack of the driver's whip, and then the world tilted and she slipped into unconsciousness. The last thing she thought before the darkness took her was this. Cedric doesn't know it yet, but he didn't just lose a wife tonight. He lost a war. Cedric woke to silence. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving Ravenshire Castle buried under 3 feet of snow. The servants moved through the halls like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their voices low. No one spoke to the Duke unless directly addressed. No one met his eyes. He stood at the window of his study, staring out at the white wasteland that had once been his estate. Somewhere out there, Vivienne was dead. He knew it with the same certainty he knew the sun would rise. No one could survive a night like that. Not a woman. Not a pregnant woman. He told himself he felt nothing. He told himself she had brought this on herself. He told himself the hollowness in his chest was just exhaustion. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said without turning. It was his steward, an elderly man named Brennan, who had served the Ravenshire family for 40 years. He entered slowly, his face carefully neutral. "Your Grace, there's news from the village." Cedric turned. "What news?" They found tracks on the southern road, leading away from the estate, but no body. Cedric felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean, no body?" Brennan hesitated. "The villagers believe Lady Vivien may have been picked up by a passing carriage. There were wheel ruts in the snow, and hoof prints, fresh ones." Cedric stared at him. "She's alive?" "We don't know, Your Grace, but it's possible." For a moment, Cedric didn't know what to feel. Relief? Anger? Shame? Then he forced the emotions down and straightened his spine. "It doesn't matter. She's no longer my concern." Brennan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps. Or disgust. "As you say, Your Grace. After the steward left, Cedric sat down at his desk and stared at the letters that had started all of this. He picked up the unsigned one, the one that claimed Vivienne had whispered another man's name. He studied the handwriting, the phrasing, the ink, and for the first time a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. What if someone wanted this to happen? He shook his head and threw the letter into the fire. It didn't matter. Even if the letters were false, the damage was done. Vivienne was gone, and whether she was alive or dead, she was no longer his wife. He would move on. He would find another woman to bear his heir. He would forget this entire disaster. But as he watched the letter burn, Cedric couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line he could never uncross. And somewhere, far beyond the walls of Ravenshire Castle, the woman he had destroyed was beginning to plot her resurrection. Cuss. Vivienne woke in a room she didn't recognize. It was small but elegant, with cream-colored walls and a window overlooking a snow-covered garden. She was lying in a soft bed, covered in thick blankets, and for a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then the pain hit, a dull, aching throb in her hands and feet, the remnants of frostbite. She gasped and tried to sit up. "Easy," a woman's voice said. "Don't move too quickly." Vivienne turned her head and saw a middle-aged woman in a plain gray dress sitting beside the bed. She had kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression, the look of someone who had seen too much suffering to be shocked by it anymore. "Where am I?" Vivienne asked. "A safe house outside London. You've been unconscious for 2 days." The woman leaned forward and pressed a cool hand to Vivienne's forehead. "My name is Margaret. I'm a physician. His Highness the Crown Prince asked me to look after you." The Crown Prince. Vivienne's memories came flooding back, the storm, the carriage, the man with the marble face who had promised to save her, Adrian Blackthorne. She had been rescued by the Crown Prince of England. "Why would he do that?" she whispered. Margaret gave her a wry smile. "You'll have to ask him yourself. He's been waiting for you to wake up." Before Vivienne could respond, the door opened and Adrian Blackthorne stepped inside. He was dressed simply, in dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made the room feel smaller. His eyes, gray, sharp, calculating, swept over Vivienne with the efficiency of a surgeon examining a patient. "Lady Ravenshire," he said, "I'm glad to see you're recovering." Vivienne stared at him. She had heard the stories about the Crown Prince, the man who had stabilized England's economy after the war, the man who had purged corruption from the royal court with the ruthlessness of a guillotine, the man who, according to rumors, hadn't smiled in 5 years, and he had saved her. "Why?" she asked again, her voice stronger this time. Adrian pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down, his movements precise and deliberate. "Because when I saw you in the snow, I recognized you. I've met your husband several times in Parliament. He struck me as the kind of man who values his reputation more than the truth. When I realized you were his wife, abandoned in a storm while pregnant, I made an assumption." "What assumption?" "That you were innocent, and that Cedric Ravenshire is a fool." Vivienne felt a sharp, bitter laugh escape her throat. "You're not wrong." Adrian's expression didn't change. "I rarely am." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked on hers. "Lady Ravenshire, I'm going to be blunt with you. You have no money, no allies, and no legal claim to your husband's estate now that he's cast you out. If you try to return to him, he'll destroy you. If you try to appeal to the courts, they'll side with him because he's a duke and you're a woman accused of adultery. You are, in every practical sense, powerless." Vivienne felt the words like a physical blow. She wanted to argue, to insist she wasn't powerless, but the truth was undeniable. Cedric had taken everything from her. Her home, her name, her future. "So what do you suggest I do?" she asked bitterly. "Disappear? Die quietly?" Adrian smiled then, and it was the coldest thing Vivienne had ever seen. "No," he said. "I suggest you become someone your husband can't afford to ignore." Vivienne blinked. "What? You're intelligent. I saw that in your eyes the moment I pulled you from the snow. You didn't beg. You didn't plead. You just assessed. That's rare." Adrian stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm going to make you an offer, Lady Ravenshire. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands the aristocracy but isn't corrupted by it, someone who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. In exchange, I'll give you protection, resources, and the chance to rebuild your life." Vivienne stared at him. You want me to work for you? I want you to survive. And if you choose to help me stabilize this kingdom in the process, all the better." For a long moment, Vivienne didn't speak. She thought about Cedric, about the way he had looked at her with such hatred, such certainty. She thought about the letters, the lies, the cruel efficiency with which he had erased her from his life. And she thought about the child growing inside her, the innocent life that deserved better than a mother broken by despair. She met Adrian's gaze and saw something unexpected there. Respect. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Adrian's smile widened, and for the first time, Vivienne saw a flicker of something almost human in his eyes. "Help me destroy the people who tried to destroy you." The first thing Vivienne learned about survival was that revenge required patience. Adrian didn't hand her a weapon and point her at Cedric. He didn't promise swift justice or dramatic confrontations. Instead, he gave her a room in a townhouse on the outskirts of London, a stack of books on political theory, and a single instruction: learn how power actually works. She spent the first 3 months reading, not novels or poetry, but reports, parliamentary proceedings, financial records, letters between nobles that Adrian's network had intercepted. She learned that England wasn't governed by laws or honor, but by favors and fear. She learned which families owed money to whom, which lords were sleeping with each other's wives, which magistrates accepted bribes. The kingdom was a spiderweb of corruption, and Adrian was systematically burning out the rot, one thread at a time. And he expected her to help. "You're wasting your time with me," Vivienne told him one evening as he reviewed her notes on a banking scandal. "I don't know anything about politics." Adrian didn't look up from the papers. "You know how to read people? That's more valuable than knowing how to draft legislation." "I was a duchess for 3 years. All I did was host dinners and smile at the right moments." Now Adrian did look up, and his gray eyes were sharp. "You spent 3 years watching powerful men lie to each other while pretending to be friends. You know who hates whom, who's desperate for money, who's sleeping with the wrong person. That's intelligence. The rest is just learning the language." Vivienne wanted to argue, but she couldn't. He was right. She had spent years sitting in drawing rooms, listening to lords gossip and scheme while their wives pretended not to notice. She had learned to read silences, to catch the moment when a man's smile didn't reach his eyes, to sense when someone was about to make a catastrophic mistake. She had just never realized it was a skill. "Fine," she said. "What do you want me to do?" Adrian slid a letter across the table. "Tell me who wrote this." Vivienne picked it up. It was addressed to a Lord Pembroke, warning him that his investments in a shipping company were about to collapse. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, the phrasing formal but urgent. She studied it for a long moment, then looked back at Adrian. A woman, educated, probably noble, but not wealthy. She's trying to help Pembroke, but she's also afraid of him. See how she apologizes 3 times in 2 paragraphs? That's someone who's used to being punished for speaking up. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Approval, maybe. Or satisfaction. "Go on." Vivienne studied the letter again. She's also in love with him. The way she writes about his investments, it's not just concern, it's personal. She's trying to save him because she can't imagine a world where he fails. Adrian took the letter back and smiled, cold and precise. "Her name is Elizabeth Carrington. She's Pembroke's mistress, and she's also the one who's been feeding information to his competitors. The warning is real, but she's the reason the investments are collapsing in the first place." Vivienne stared at him. Why would she sabotage him if she loves him? Because Pembroke promised to leave his wife for her 2 years ago and never did. This is her way of forcing his hand. If he loses everything, he'll have no reason to stay in his marriage. She thinks she's rescuing him. She doesn't realize she's destroying both of them. Vivienne felt something cold settle in her chest. "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been watching Pembroke for 6 months. He's one of the men who's been blocking my banking reforms in Parliament." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Tomorrow, I'm going to visit him with evidence of his mistress's betrayal. He'll be so furious he'll vote for anything I put in front of him just to spite her. And Elizabeth Carrington will spend the rest of her life wondering why the man she loved decided to ruin her. That's cruel. That's politics." Adrian's voice was flat, emotionless. "Pembroke is a parasite who's been stealing from the crown for a decade. Elizabeth is collateral damage. I don't enjoy it, but I don't lose sleep over it either." Vivienne looked down at the letter again, at the desperate handwriting of a woman who thought love was enough to change a man. She thought about Cedric, about the way she had believed he would listen to her, believe her, choose her. She had been just as naive as Elizabeth Carrington. "Teach me," she said quietly. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Teach you what?" "How to stop being collateral damage." For a long moment, Adrian studied her. Then he nodded once, sharp and definitive. "All right, but understand this, Lady Ravenshire. Once you start playing this game, you can't stop. You'll see people you once considered friends as assets or obstacles. You'll make choices that will keep you awake at night. And when you finally get your revenge, you'll realize it cost you more than you thought you could afford to pay." Vivienne met his gaze without flinching. "Good, because I don't want to be the woman I was. I want to be someone Cedric can't touch." Adrian smiled then, and it was the first time she had seen genuine warmth in his expression. "Then let's get to work." The first time Vivienne entered a room full of nobles again, she almost turned around and walked out. It was a fundraising gala for the Royal Hospital, held in one of London's grandest ballrooms. Adrian had insisted she attend, claiming she needed to start rebuilding her social presence. He had also insisted she wear a gown he'd had commissioned, deep emerald silk that fit her like armor, cut low enough to be striking but not scandalous. Her pregnancy was now visible, a small swell beneath the fabric that she no longer tried to hide. "You're going to draw attention," Adrian had warned her. "Let them stare. Let them whisper. Don't apologize for existing." So Vivienne walked into the ballroom with her head high and her hand resting on her stomach, and the room went silent. She saw the moment recognition rippled through the crowd. Lady Ravenshire, the disgraced Duchess, the woman who had vanished into a snowstorm and was supposed to be dead. She watched nobles lean toward each other, mouths moving behind gloved hands. She saw pity in some eyes, contempt in others, and hunger in a few. Scandal was currency in London, and she was suddenly the wealthiest woman in the room. Adrian appeared at her side, his hand light on her elbow. "Breathe," he said quietly. "You're not prey anymore." Vivienne forced herself to inhale. "I feel like every person here wants to see me fall apart." "They do. So don't give them the satisfaction." Adrian guided her toward the center of the room, and the crowd parted like water. "Lady Ravenshire has agreed to assist me with several humanitarian initiatives," he announced to no one in particular. "I expect you'll all treat her with the respect she deserves." It wasn't a request. It was a command. And because Adrian Blackthorne was the crown prince, because he held the power to ruin any family in that room with a single word, they obeyed. Lords, who had probably laughed about her disgrace, now bowed stiffly. Ladies who had gossiped about her affair now smiled with their teeth and offered hollow compliments. Vivienne smiled back and said nothing. Then she saw him. Cedric was standing near the far wall, a glass of wine in his hand, his expression carefully neutral. He was dressed in formal black, his dark hair swept back, his posture rigid. He looked older than she remembered, harder. And when his eyes met hers across the room, she saw something flicker in them, shock, confusion. And beneath it all, something that might have been regret. Vivienne felt her heart beat spike. She hadn't expected to see him here. She had known it was possible, but she hadn't prepared herself for the reality of it. For the way her body still remembered him, the way her chest tightened at the sight of his face. Adrian's hand tightened on her arm. "Do you want to leave?" "No," Vivienne said. Her voice was steady, cold. "I want him to see me." She started walking toward Cedric, and Adrian followed without a word. The crowd watched, sensing blood in the water. Cedric didn't move. He just stood there, frozen, as Vivienne stopped 3 feet away from him and smiled. "Your Grace," she said. "It's been a long time." Cedric's jaw tightened. "Vivienne," she gestured toward her stomach. "As you can see, I survived." For a moment, Cedric didn't speak. He looked at her belly, then at her face, and something cracked in his expression. I didn't know. Didn't know I was alive? Or didn't care?" Cedric flinched. "That's not— Save it!" Vivienne's voice was sharp, cutting. "I didn't come over here for an apology. I came to let you know that I'm done being the woman you threw away. From now on, when people talk about Lady Ravenshire, they won't be talking about scandal or shame. They'll be talking about what I've built without you." Cedric's eyes darted to Adrian, who was watching the exchange with detached interest. "You're with him now?" I'm under his protection. Vivienne emphasized the word, making it clear there was nothing romantic in the arrangement. Unlike you, the Crown Prince understands the value of loyalty. Cedric's face went pale. Vivienne, if I had known what? That the letters were lies? That I was telling the truth? Vivienne stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You didn't care about the truth, Cedric. You cared about your pride. And when I stopped being convenient, you erased me. I made a mistake. You made a choice. Vivienne turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him. And so did I. I chose to survive you. She walked away, Adrian at her side, and left Cedric standing alone in the center of the ballroom. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel his eyes on her, feel the weight of his realization settling over him like a shroud. That was well done, Adrian said quietly. Vivienne's hands were shaking. I feel like I'm going to be sick. You will! Later! Right now, you need to keep your head up. Adrian guided her toward the terrace doors. Every person in that room just watched you humiliate a duke. You're not invisible anymore. Vivienne stepped out into the cold night air and gripped the railing, her breath coming in short gasps. She had spent months preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she would say, how she would act. But nothing had prepared her for the way Cedric had looked at her, like he had finally realized what he'd lost. And she hated that a part of her still cared. The months that followed were brutal. Vivienne threw herself into Adrian's work with the focus of someone who had nothing left to lose. She attended every meeting, read every report, memorized every name and face. She learned to speak the language of power, how to make a threat sound like a suggestion, how to smile while destroying someone's career, how to turn an ally into an enemy and back again without anyone noticing. She also learned how to fight. Adrian had insisted on it. You're going to make enemies, he'd told her. Some of them will come after you with words. Others won't be so polite. So Vivienne spent her mornings in a private training room, learning how to throw a punch, how to break a grip, how to use a knife. Her instructor was a former soldier named Marcus, who treated her like any other recruit. No sympathy, no mercy. He knocked her down a dozen times before she learned how to stay on her feet. He disarmed her until she learned to keep her weapon close. And when she finally landed a solid hit on him, he grinned and said, "Good. Now do it faster." Her body changed as the pregnancy progressed, but she didn't stop training. She just adapted. Marcus taught her how to fight from a disadvantaged position, how to use her center of gravity, how to turn vulnerability into a weapon. And when she delivered her son in a quiet room with only a midwife and Margaret the physician present, she held the baby and thought, "You'll never be ashamed of me." She named him Alexander. Not after anyone, just a name that sounded strong. Adrian visited the day after the birth, carrying a small wooden box. He set it on the table beside her bed and opened it without ceremony. Inside was a ring, gold, with the royal crest engraved on the surface. "What is this?" Vivienne asked. "Insurance." Adrian's voice was matter-of-fact. "If anyone tries to harm you or your son, that ring will get you into any royal property in England. It also means you're under my formal protection. No one can touch you without answering to me." Vivienne stared at the ring. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you're useful." Adrian met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "And because I don't believe in letting good people get destroyed by bad ones." "I'm not sure I'm a good person anymore." Adrian smiled, cold and sharp. "Good. That means you're learning." Over the next 3 years, Vivienne became someone even she didn't fully recognize. She dismantled corrupt magistrates with forged documents. She blackmailed lords into voting for Adrian's reforms. She exposed affairs, bankruptcies, and treason with the efficiency of a surgeon cutting out cancer. And she did it all while raising Alexander, teaching him to read and write and question everything. She also started to understand something Adrian had tried to warn her about. Revenge had a cost. Every time she destroyed someone's career, she thought about Elizabeth Carrington, the mistress who had tried to save the man she loved and ended up ruining them both. Every time she made a choice that hurt an innocent person to achieve a larger goal, she felt a piece of herself die. And every time she looked at Alexander, she wondered what kind of mother she was becoming. But she didn't stop, because stopping meant going back to being the woman Cedric had thrown away. And that woman was dead. The conspiracy unraveled slowly, then all at once. It started with a name Vivienne found buried in a financial report, Lord Ashford. The same man who had written the first letter to Cedric, warning him about Captain Hale. Vivienne had memorized that name years ago, carried it like a splinter under her skin. And now she had found him in a list of investors tied to a smuggling operation Adrian had been investigating for months. She brought the report to Adrian immediately. He studied it for a long time, his expression darkening. "Ashford," he said quietly. "He's been on my list for years. I've never been able to prove anything. What if he's the one who set me up?" Adrian looked at her. "Explain." Vivienne laid out the timeline. The letters had arrived just before her pregnancy announcement. Ashford had been one of Cedric's closest allies, and the smuggling operation had used Ravenshire lands as a route, something that would have required Cedric's distraction or approval. "You think Ashford wanted to manipulate your husband," Adrian said. "I think he wanted Cedric unstable." Vivienne's voice was cold. A duke consumed by personal scandal is easier to control than one focused on his estate. Ashford needed Cedric distracted so he could use Ravenshire lands without oversight. That's plausible. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "But we need proof." So Vivienne found it. She spent 2 months tracing payments, intercepting letters, and bribing servants. She discovered that Ashford had hired the writer who delivered the first letter. She found evidence that the handwriting in the second letter, the one claiming Vivienne had whispered another man's name, matched Ashford's mistress, a woman named Catherine, who did calligraphy for extra money. And she found the final piece, a ledger showing that Ashford had paid Captain Hale's commanding officer to station him near Ravenshire during Cedric's absences. It was all fake. Every piece of evidence Cedric had used to destroy her had been manufactured by a man who wanted control of Ravenshire's trade routes. When Vivienne showed Adrian the proof, he didn't smile. He just nodded once and said, "We'll destroy him." But first Vivienne said, "I want Cedric to know the truth." "Why?" "Because I want him to understand exactly what he did." Vivienne's hands were steady, her voice cold. "I want him to know he didn't just lose me. He lost me for nothing." Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a piece of parchment. "I'll arrange a meeting. But Vivienne, when you face him, don't expect closure. Cedric Ravenshire destroyed you because it was easier than trusting you. Men like that don't change. They just learn to hide their cowardice better. I don't want him to change." Vivienne's voice was flat. "I just want him to suffer." The meeting happened in a private room at the Palace of Westminster, neutral ground where neither Cedric nor Vivienne could claim advantage. Adrian had arranged it under the pretense of resolving a land dispute, but when Cedric arrived and saw Vivienne sitting beside the crown prince, his expression went rigid. "What is this?" he demanded. "Sit down," Adrian said. It wasn't a request. Cedric sat, his eyes never leaving Vivienne. She met his gaze without flinching, noting the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in years. "We have information about the letters you received 4 years ago," Adrian began. "The ones that led to your decision regarding Lady Ravenshire." "Those letters were private," Cedric said stiffly. "They were also fabricated." Adrian slid the ledger across the table. "Lord Ashford orchestrated the entire thing. He paid for the letters, hired the witnesses, and manipulated you into casting out your wife so he could use your lands for smuggling." Cedric stared at the ledger. His hands were shaking. That's not possible. "It's documented." Adrian's voice was cold. "Every payment, every lie. Captain Hale was stationed near Ravenshire on Ashford's orders. The second letter was written by Ashford's mistress. Even the rumors about your wife were planted by men Ashford paid." Cedric's face had gone ashen. He looked at Vivienne, and for the first time since the night he threw her out, she saw genuine horror in his eyes. "Vivienne," he whispered, "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know." Vivienne's voice was steady, brutal. "You wanted an excuse to get rid of me, and Ashford gave you one, so you took it." "That's not true. I loved you. You loved your pride more." Vivienne leaned forward. "You could have waited. You could have investigated. You could have given me one day to prove my innocence. But you didn't. Because deep down, you wanted to believe the worst of me." Cedric's jaw worked. "I made a mistake. You made a choice, and that choice killed the woman I was." Vivienne stood, and Adrian stood with her. "I came here to tell you that I forgive you, Cedric. Not because you deserve it, but because I'm done letting you live in my head." Vivien, please. She turned and walked toward the door, then paused without looking back. By the way, the child you thought was a bastard? He's 4 years old now. His name is Alexander, and he'll never know your name. She left Cedric sitting in that room, his world crumbling around him, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just the cold, empty certainty that she had finally cut the last thread tying her to the woman she used to be. Outside, Adrian was waiting. How do you feel? Like I just killed someone, Vivien said quietly. You did. Adrian started walking and Vivien fell into step beside him. The version of Cedric Ravenshire who thought he was untouchable just died. What happens next is up to him. What happens to Ashford? He'll be arrested within the hour. Adrian's voice was matter-of-fact. He'll be tried for treason, smuggling, and conspiracy. He'll hang. Vivien nodded. She should have felt something. Triumph, vindication, justice. But all she felt was tired. What happens to me now? She asked. Adrian stopped walking and looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable. That depends. Are you finished? Finished with what? With revenge. Adrian's voice was quiet. You've spent 4 years becoming someone who can't be destroyed. You've proven you're stronger than the men who tried to break you. So now you have a choice. You can disappear, raise your son, live quietly, or what? Or you can stay. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his voice. I need people I can trust, Vivien. People who understand what it costs to survive. You've earned your freedom. But if you want to use what you've learned to change this kingdom, I'll give you that chance. Vivien thought about Alexander, about the kind of world she wanted him to grow up in. A world where power didn't mean cruelty, where loyalty wasn't a weakness, where people like Ashford couldn't destroy lives on a whim. She thought about Cedric sitting alone in that room, finally understanding what he'd lost. And she thought about the woman she had been, naive, trusting, powerless. She never wanted to be that woman again. I'll stay, she said. Adrian nodded once. Then let's get to work. That night, as Vivien tucked Alexander into bed, he looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Mama, he said, why do people hurt each other? Vivien brushed the hair from his forehead and kissed him gently. Because they're afraid, she said, and fear makes people do terrible things. Are you afraid? Every day, Vivien admitted, but I don't let it stop me. Alexander smiled, already half asleep. You're the bravest person I know. Vivien sat there in the dark long after he fell asleep, her hand resting on his small chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She thought about the choices she had made, the line she had crossed, the person she had become, and she made a promise to the boy sleeping beside her. I will never let anyone make you feel powerless. I will teach you to be kind, but never weak. And I will build a world where you never have to choose between survival and your soul. Because Vivien had made that choice 4 years ago in a snowstorm, and she was still paying the price. But Alexander never would. That was the one thing she would make sure of, no matter what it cost her. Even if it meant she could never go back to being the woman she was. Even if it meant becoming someone she didn't fully recognize in the mirror. Even if it meant standing beside a crown prince who saw people as pieces on a board and learning to see the world the same way. She had crossed the point of no return the night Cedric threw her into the storm. Everything since then had just been learning to live with it. 4 years of rebuilding, and Vivien had learned that power was a blade with no handle. You could wield it, but it always cut you somewhere. She stood in the war room of the Crown Prince's estate. Maps and intelligence reports spread across the table like entrails. Adrian was across from her, his face illuminated by the cold morning light filtering through tall windows. They had just received word that Parliament would vote on the Judiciary Reform Act in 3 days, a bill that would strip corrupt magistrates of their immunity and install independent overseers. It was the culmination of 4 years of work, thousands of hours spent gathering evidence, blackmailing opponents, and dismantling the aristocratic machine that had protected men like Ashford. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Vivien felt the prickle of unease at the base of her skull, the instinct that had kept her alive through 4 winters of political warfare. Something was wrong. She just couldn't see it yet. We have the votes, Adrian said, tracing a line across the parliamentary roster. 18 confirmed. 9 leaning our direction. Only 6 firmly opposed. 6 is still 6, Vivien replied. She had learned not to trust numbers until the ink dried on the ballot. Men changed their minds when money or fear entered the equation. The six won't matter. Adrian's confidence was absolute, the kind of certainty that came from never having lost a political battle. We've neutralized their allies, cut off their funding. They have nothing left to bargain with. Vivienne studied the map. Her eyes caught on a name scrawled in the margin. Lord Harcourt, one of the leaning votes. She had met him twice, both times at state functions. He had smiled too much, agreed too easily, asked no difficult questions. Men like that were either cowards or actors. "What do we know about Harcourt?" she asked. Adrian glanced up. Minor noble, estate in Sussex. No significant debts, no scandals, no leverage. He's been neutral on most issues. That's the problem. Vivienne tapped the name with her finger. Neutral men don't stay neutral when the stakes are this high. Either someone owns him or he's waiting to be bought. We don't have time to investigate every... Then make time. Vivienne's voice sharpened. I've spent 4 years watching you dismantle men who underestimated their enemies. Don't become one of them. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Fine. I'll have someone look into Harcourt. But they didn't have someone. They had Vivienne. So that night, she pulled Harcourt's financial records, his correspondence, his family history. She traced his property holdings, his business partnerships, his social connections. And 3 hours before dawn, she found it. Harcourt wasn't neutral. He was owned by Cedric. Vivienne didn't sleep. She sat in her study as the sun rose, staring at the documents spread across her desk. Harcourt's estate was hemorrhaging money. Bad investments, failed crops, debts accumulating like rot. And 6 months ago, Cedric had quietly paid off every single one. Not through a loan, through a gift. No terms, no contract, no public record. Just money appearing in Harcourt's accounts like rain from a clear sky. It was the kind of move a man made when he wanted something but couldn't afford to be seen asking for it. Vivienne's hands were shaking. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself it was anger. But underneath, she knew it was fear. Cedric had been quiet for 4 years. After their meeting at Westminster, after learning the truth about Ashford's conspiracy, he had withdrawn from public life. He still attended Parliament, still managed his estate, but he no longer sought influence. He voted with the moderates, stayed out of political battles, and never spoke Vivienne's name. She had convinced herself he was broken, neutralized. She had been wrong. When Adrian arrived that morning, she handed him the documents without a word. He read them twice, his expression darkening with each pass. How long has this been happening? He asked quietly. 6 months. Maybe longer. Vivienne's voice was flat. Harcourt isn't the only one. I found 3 other lords with similar patterns. Debts disappearing. Estates stabilizing. All of them leaning votes on the Reform Act. Adrian set the papers down. His hands were steady, but something cold had entered his eyes. Cedric is buying Parliament. He's buying our votes. Vivienne stood and walked to the window. Every person we thought was swaying toward reform. They've been compromised. And we didn't see it because Cedric made it look like charity instead of bribery. How many votes do we lose? Adrian calculated quickly, his mind sorting variables like a machine. If Harcourt and the others flip, we're down to 14 confirmed. We need 18 to pass, so we're dead. Not yet. Adrian's voice was sharp, decisive. We expose Cedric's payments, prove he's corrupting Parliament, force the others to distance themselves or risk being tied to the scandal. Vivienne shook her head. That won't work. Cedric didn't break any laws. He gave gifts to struggling nobles. There's no contract, no explicit quid pro quo. All we'd prove is that he's generous. Then we find leverage on Harcourt directly. Threaten to expose... There's nothing to expose. Vivienne turned to face him. Harcourt is clean except for the debt, and Cedric solved that problem. We have no cards to play. Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then he said something Vivienne had never heard from him before. I don't know what to do. The admission hit her like a physical blow. Adrian Blackthorne, the crown prince who had outmaneuvered every opponent, who had rebuilt England's economy and purged corruption with surgical precision, was admitting defeat. And it was because of Cedric. The man who had thrown her into a storm 4 years ago had just dismantled 4 years of work with nothing but money and patience. Boshir, Vivienne spent the next 2 days tearing apart every piece of intelligence they had, looking for a weakness, a crack, anything. She interrogated informants, bribed servants, and traced financial records until her eyes burned. She barely slept. She didn't eat. Alexander asked her twice if she was all right, and both times she lied. On the third day, 12 hours before the vote, she found it. Not a weakness in Cedric's plan. A weakness in Cedric himself. She had been reviewing old correspondence when she noticed a pattern. Every payment Cedric made to the compromised lords had come from a specific account, one tied to his late father's estate. And that estate had been liquidating assets for months, selling land, auctioning heirlooms, converting everything to cash. Cedric wasn't buying Parliament with surplus wealth. He was burning through his inheritance. He was bankrupting himself to stop the Reform Act. Vivienne stared at the numbers, her mind racing. Why would Cedric destroy his own fortune to block judicial reform? He wasn't corrupt. He didn't profit from magistrate immunity. It made no sense unless he was doing it for her. The realization hit her like ice water. Cedric knew the Reform Act was Vivienne's project. He knew it was her attempt to reshape the system that had failed her, to prevent other women from being destroyed the way she had been. And he was dismantling it not because he opposed reform, but because he couldn't stand the idea of her succeeding without him. It was the most pathetic, desperate, destructive act of pride she had ever seen, and she was going to use it to destroy him. Dictate. Vivienne found Cedric in his London residence, a townhouse near the Parliament buildings. She didn't send a message ahead. She just walked up to the door and knocked until the butler answered, his face pale with shock. Lady Ravenshire, I'm afraid his grace is not. Tell him I know what he's doing. Vivienne's voice was cold, final. And if he doesn't see me right now, I'll make sure every lord in England knows he's bankrupting himself out of spite. The butler hesitated, then disappeared into the house. 5 minutes later, Cedric appeared. He looked worse than she remembered. Thinner, older. His clothes were still immaculate, his posture still rigid, but there was something hollow in his eyes, something that reminded Vivienne of a man staring at his own grave. Vivienne, he said quietly, come in. She followed him into a sitting room that felt like a museum. Everything was perfectly arranged, perfectly maintained, perfectly lifeless. Cedric gestured toward a chair, but Vivienne remained standing. I know about Harcourt, she said. I know about the others. I know you've been buying votes to kill the Reform Act. Cedric didn't deny it. He just poured himself a drink and stared into the glass. It's not illegal. It's sabotage. It's politics. Cedric's voice was flat. You should understand that by now. Vivienne stepped closer. Why are you doing this? You don't care about judicial reform. You've never cared about magistrate oversight, so why spend your entire fortune trying to stop it? Cedric finally looked at her, and Vivienne saw something raw in his expression, something that looked almost like grief. Because I can't watch you succeed. The honesty of it stunned her. She had expected denial, justification, anything but this naked admission of pettiness. That's insane, she said. I know. Cedric drank, then set the glass down with a sharp click. I know it's insane. I know it's self-destructive. I know I'm burning everything my family built for 3 centuries just to hurt you, and I can't stop. Why not? Because every time I see your name in a report, every time I hear about another bill you've helped pass, another corrupt lord you've exposed, I'm reminded that you became everything you are because I destroyed you. Cedric's voice cracked. You're brilliant and powerful and untouchable, and it's my fault. I made you this way, and I can't stand it. Vivienne felt something cold settle in her chest. So you're tearing down everything I've built out of guilt? Out of hatred? Cedric's eyes were hard now, vicious. I hate that you survived me. I hate that you're stronger without me than you ever were with me. And most of all, I hate that I still... He stopped himself, but Vivienne knew what he had been about to say. That you still love me? She finished, her voice bitter. Is that what this is? Some twisted attempt to prove you still matter? I don't know what it is. Cedric's hands were shaking. All I know is that watching you win feels like dying slowly. So if I have to drag you down to survive, I will. Vivienne stared at him. This man who had once been her husband, who had thrown her into a storm and spent 4 years drowning in regret, And she realized something that made her stomach turn. She pitied him. "You're pathetic," she said quietly. Cedric flinched as if she'd struck him. "You had everything, Cedric. A wife who loved you, a child, a future. And you threw it away because you were too proud to trust me. Now you're burning your fortune, destroying your legacy, and sabotaging the one thing that might actually fix the system that failed us both. And for what? So you can feel like you still have power over me? It's all I have left." "No." Vivienne's voice was sharp, cutting. "You have nothing left. You spent it all trying to hurt me. And the worst part is, it's not even working. Because I stopped caring about you the moment I realized you were never worth saving." Cedric's face went pale. "Vivienne, I came here to offer you a choice," she interrupted. "Withdraw your support from Harcourt and the others. Let the Reform Act pass. In exchange, I'll make sure no one knows you were involved. You'll lose your money, but you'll keep your reputation. And if I refuse, then I expose everything." Vivienne stepped closer. "I'll show Parliament that you spent your entire inheritance trying to sabotage judicial reform out of personal spite. I'll make sure every noble in England knows the great Duke of Ravenshire bankrupted himself because he couldn't handle his ex-wife's success. And when you're finished, when you've lost everything, I'll make sure Alexander knows exactly what kind of man his father is." Cedric stared at her, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You wouldn't. Try me." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Cedric laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You've become just like him. Like Adrian, cold, calculating, willing to destroy anyone who gets in your way. I became what I needed to be to survive you. And do you like what you've become?" The question hit harder than Vivienne expected. She thought about the woman she had been 4 years ago, naive and trusting and powerless. She thought about the choices she had made, the lines she had crossed, the people she had hurt. And she thought about Alexander, asleep in his bed, safe and loved and unaware of the war his mother was fighting. "It doesn't matter if I like it," she said finally. "It's who I am now." Cedric nodded slowly. "Then you've already lost." He walked to his desk and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are letters of instruction to Harcourt and the others, telling them to withdraw their support." He signed each one with deliberate care, then handed them to Vivienne. "You win. Again." Vivienne took the letters, but she felt no triumph, just exhaustion. "This isn't about winning, Cedric. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." "Noble words." Cedric's voice was hollow. "But we both know you're lying. This is about revenge. It's always been about revenge." "Maybe." Vivienne turned toward the door. "But at least I'm honest about what I've become. You're still pretending you're the victim." She left him standing in that lifeless room, surrounded by the remnants of a life he had destroyed with his own hands. And as she walked out into the cold London night, letters clutched in her fist, Vivienne realized something that made her chest tighten. Cedric was right. She had become exactly like Adrian, cold, calculating, willing to sacrifice anything for victory, and she didn't know how to stop. The Reform Act passed with 16 votes. 2 fewer than they'd hoped, but enough. Adrian called it a triumph. Parliament called it historic. The newspapers called it the beginning of a new era of accountability and justice. Vivienne called it hollow. She stood in Adrian's estate the night after the vote, watching him pour champagne for the staffers who had worked on the bill. They were celebrating, laughing, toasting to the future. Vivienne held her glass but didn't drink. She couldn't shake the image of Cedric signing those letters, his hands trembling, his face a mask of defeat. "You did well," Adrian said, appearing at her side. "This wouldn't have happened without you. I blackmailed my ex-husband into bankrupting himself." Vivienne's voice was flat. "That's not exactly heroic. It's effective." Adrian sipped his champagne. "And in politics, that's what matters." "Is it?" Adrian studied her, his gray eyes sharp. "You're having doubts." "I'm having thoughts. Dangerous." Adrian's tone was light, but there was an edge beneath it. Thoughts lead to hesitation. Hesitation leads to mistakes. What if the mistake was becoming this? Vivienne gestured vaguely at the room, at the celebration, at herself. What if we've turned into the thing we were trying to fight? We haven't. Adrian's voice was firm. We're building something better, cleaner, fairer, by using the same tactics as the people we're trying to stop. Yes. Adrian didn't flinch from the admission. Because the world doesn't change through kindness, Vivienne. It changes through power, and power requires sacrifice. What have you sacrificed? The question hung in the air like smoke. Adrian's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something that might have been pain. Everything, he said quietly. I sacrificed the person I might have been. I sacrificed friendships, love, peace. I sacrificed the ability to trust anyone completely, because trust is a weapon people use against you. And I did it all because someone has to hold the knife. And I'd rather it be me than someone who'll use it for cruelty instead of justice. Vivienne looked at him, this man who had saved her life and taught her to be ruthless, and she realized she didn't know him at all. She knew his strategies, his goals, his methods, but she didn't know what kept him awake at night, what he regretted, what he feared. Do you ever wish you could go back? She asked. Be someone else? Every day. Adrian's voice was soft, honest, but wishing doesn't change reality. And reality is that England needs people willing to make hard choices, people like us. People like us. The phrase felt like a brand. Vivienne thought about the woman she had been, the Duchess who believed love and loyalty mattered more than power. That woman would have been horrified by the person Vivienne had become. That woman would have called her a monster. That woman was dead, and Vivienne had killed her. I need to go, she said abruptly. Adrian nodded. Get some rest. We have work tomorrow. But Vivienne didn't go home. She walked through London streets for hours, her mind churning. She thought about Cedric, about the hollow look in his eyes when he admitted he was destroying himself out of spite. She thought about Ashford, hanged for treason while his family watched. She thought about Elizabeth Carrington, the mistress who tried to save the man she loved and ended up ruined. She thought about all the people she had hurt, manipulated, destroyed in the name of justice. And she thought about Alexander. Her son was 4 years old, bright and curious and full of questions. He asked her why the sky was blue, why people lied, why some families had more than others. And Vivienne answered him as honestly as she could, trying to teach him to be kind but not weak, to be strong but not cruel. But what was she teaching him by example? That power mattered more than people. That winning justified any cost. That survival required becoming someone you didn't recognize in the mirror. She didn't want that for him. She didn't want that for herself. But she didn't know how to stop. Tesh. The summons came 3 days later. It was delivered by royal courier, a formal letter bearing the king's seal. Vivienne's hands shook as she broke it open. Lady Vivien Ravenshire, you are cordially invited to the Royal Unity celebration to be held at Buckingham Palace in honor of the Crown Prince, Adrian Blackthorne's continued service to the realm. Your presence is requested for a matter of significant importance. Vivienne read it twice, searching for subtext. The Royal Unity celebration was a public event, broadcast across the kingdom, attended by every noble and dignitary who mattered. It was theater, not governance. Adrian had never asked her to attend something like this before. Something was happening, something big. She brought the letter to Adrian that afternoon. He was in his study, surrounded by maps and reports. But when he saw the envelope in her hand, his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something sharper. You got yours too, he said. What is this about? Adrian leaned back in his chair. It's time. Time for what? For the next move. Adrian's voice was calm, measured. We've spent 4 years dismantling the old system. Now we need to build the new one, and that requires legitimacy. Vivienne felt ice crawl up her spine. What are you planning? Something that will change everything. Adrian met her gaze, and for the first time, Vivienne saw something that looked like vulnerability in his eyes. But I need to know you're with me, always. Even if it costs you everything you've built? The question was a knife. Vivienne stared at him, her mind racing through possibilities. What could cost her everything? What move was Adrian planning that required this kind of warning? And then she understood. He was going to marry her. Not for love, for politics. To cement an alliance between the crown and the reform movement, to legitimize her position and Alexander's future, to make her untouchable in a way even Adrian's protection couldn't guarantee. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was everything she should want, and it terrified her. Because marrying Adrian would mean crossing a line she couldn't uncross. It would mean becoming part of the machine permanently. It would mean giving up any chance of being the person she used to be. of teaching Alexander that power wasn't everything, of finding some kind of peace. It would mean choosing survival over her soul. Vivienne looked at Adrian, this man who had saved her and shaped her and turned her into a weapon. And she realized she didn't know if she could say yes, but she didn't know if she could say no either. "The celebration is in 2 weeks," Adrian said quietly. "You don't have to answer now, but Vivienne, when you walk into that palace, you need to be ready, because what happens there will determine the rest of your life." He was right, and that was exactly what terrified her, because 4 years ago, Vivienne had made a choice to survive at any cost. Now she was about to find out what that cost actually was. Vivienne stood alone in her room that night, staring at the formal gown that had been delivered for the celebration. It was white and gold, elegant and regal, the kind of dress a queen might wear, the kind of dress that signified power and permanence and a future carved in stone. She thought about Cedric, broken and bankrupt, haunted by the woman he destroyed. She thought about Adrian, cold and calculating, willing to sacrifice anything for victory. She thought about herself, caught between the woman she was and the woman she had become. And she thought about Alexander sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware that his mother was about to make a choice that would define his entire future. Vivienne picked up the dress and held it against her body, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back was beautiful, powerful, untouchable, and completely unrecognizable. In 2 weeks, the entire kingdom would see her standing beside the crown prince. They would see her elevated, legitimized, transformed into something more than the disgraced duchess thrown into a storm. But Vivienne knew the truth. She wasn't being elevated. She was being consumed. And the worst part was, she didn't know if she had the strength to refuse, because refusing meant losing everything she had built. Refusing meant becoming vulnerable again. Refusing meant admitting that 4 years of survival had been a mistake, that revenge wasn't worth the person she had become, that power was a cage instead of freedom. And Vivienne had spent 4 years convincing herself that cages were safer than storms. Now she had to decide if she still believed it. The clock was ticking, and in 2 weeks, the entire kingdom would watch her make a choice she couldn't take back. Vivienne stood in front of the mirror wearing the white and gold gown, and for the first time in 4 years, she let herself feel afraid. Not the animal fear of survival, the kind that had kept her moving through snowstorms and political warfare. This was different. This was the fear of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the next step was a choice, not an accident. She could see both futures stretched out before her, one where she married Adrian and became untouchable, and one where she refused and lost everything she had built. Both paths led to different kinds of death. The question was which version of herself she was willing to kill. Alexander knocked on her door, his small voice muffled through the wood. "Mama, can I come in?" Vivienne took a breath and opened the door. Her son stood there in his nightshirt, his dark hair messy from sleep, his eyes wide and curious. He looked so much like Cedric it made her chest ache. The same sharp jawline, the same way his eyebrows drew together when he was thinking. But his kindness was all hers. She had made sure of that. "You look like a princess," Alexander said. "I'm not a princess," Vivienne replied, kneeling so they were eye to eye. "Just your mama." "Are you going to marry Prince Adrian?" The question was so direct it knocked the air from her lungs. She had been careful, so careful, never to let Alexander see the political machinery she lived inside. He knew Adrian as a kind man who visited sometimes, who brought him books and asked about his studies. He didn't know Adrian was the crown prince. He didn't know his mother was one of the most dangerous people in England. "Where did you hear that?" Vivienne asked carefully. "The servants talk." Alexander's voice was matter-of-fact. "They said Prince Adrian is going to ask you at the big celebration. They said you'll say yes because it's smart." Smart. The word tasted bitter. Vivienne had spent 4 years being smart, calculating, strategic, ruthless. And it had gotten her power and safety and a future carved from other people's ruins. But it hadn't gotten her peace. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Alexander considered this seriously, his small face scrunched in concentration. "I think you should do what makes you happy, not what's smart. And if being happy isn't smart, then being smart isn't worth it." Vivienne pulled him close and held him tight, breathing in the scent of soap and sleep and innocence. This child, this perfect small person, was the only thing in her life that hadn't been corrupted by strategy. He loved her without calculation. He trusted her without conditions. And if she married Adrian, she would be teaching him that power mattered more than happiness, that survival justified any sacrifice, that becoming a weapon was the only way to stay safe. She would be teaching him to become her. "Go back to bed," she whispered. "I'll figure it out." After Alexander left, Vivienne sat alone in the dark and made a decision that terrified her more than anything she had done in 4 years. She was going to refuse Adrian, not because it was smart, not because it was strategic, but because she had spent 4 years becoming someone she didn't recognize. And if she took one more step down that path, she would lose the last piece of herself that still remembered how to be human, even if it cost her everything, even if it meant losing Adrian's protection, the political power she had built, the safety that kept Alexander secure, even if it meant standing alone against a kingdom that still saw her as the disgraced duchess who should have died in a snowstorm. She would find another way. She had survived Cedric. She had survived Ashford. She would survive this too. But first, she had to tell Adrian. So, Vivienne found Adrian in the palace chapel the morning of the celebration. It was the one place she had never expected to find him. Adrian despised ritual and ceremony, considered them wastes of time better spent on governance. But there he was, standing alone in the empty space, staring up at the vaulted ceiling as if it held answers. "I didn't know you came here," Vivienne said. Adrian didn't turn around. "I don't. Not usually." "Then why now?" "Because in 6 hours, I'm going to ask you a question in front of the entire kingdom. And I wanted to make sure I could live with either answer." Vivienne walked closer, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in her head, planned exactly what to say, how to phrase it so Adrian would understand. But standing here watching him stare at the ceiling like a man searching for permission he would never receive, all her carefully prepared words evaporated. "I can't marry you," she said simply. Adrian's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. "I know, you know? I've known for 3 days." Adrian's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You've been pulling back, making contingency plans, distancing yourself from the inner circle." "I'm not blind, Vivienne." "Then why go through with the celebration?" "Because I had to give you the choice." Adrian finally turned to face her, and Vivienne saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Sadness. "You've spent 4 years following my lead, making yourself into someone I needed you to be. I owed you the chance to decide if that's who you want to stay." Vivienne felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know who I am anymore." "Yes, you do." Adrian stepped closer. "You're the woman who survived a storm that should have killed her. You're the mother raising a son who still believes kindness matters. You're the strategist who dismantled England's corruption with nothing but intelligence and will. You're all of those things, Vivienne. The question is which one you want to be going forward. I want to be someone Alexander isn't ashamed of." "Then walk away." Adrian's voice was firm, decisive. "Walk away from me, from the politics, from all of it. Take Alexander somewhere quiet. Raise him to be better than us. Let him grow up believing the world is kind because you made it that way for him. And what happens to you?" "I'll do what I've always done." Adrian's smile was cold, resigned. "I'll hold the knife. I'll make the hard choices. I'll be the monster so other people don't have to be. It's what I'm good at." "You're not a monster." "Yes, I am." Adrian's voice was flat. "I've ruined lives, Vivienne. I've destroyed families. I've made choices that kept me awake for weeks. And I did it all knowing I could never go back to being the person I was before. You still have that choice. Don't waste it." Vivienne stared at him. This man who had saved her life and taught her to be ruthless, and was now giving her permission to walk away. And she realized something that made her chest tighten. Adrian had never wanted her to become like him. He had wanted her to survive. And somewhere along the way, he had started hoping she would be strong enough to choose a different path. "What if I said I wanted to stay?" she asked quietly. "What if I said yes tonight? Then I would spend the rest of my life wondering if you meant it." Adrian's gray eyes were honest, unflinching. "And you would spend the rest of yours resenting me for asking. That's not a marriage, Vivienne. That's a transaction, and you've been through enough of those, so this is it. We just end." "We don't end." Adrian reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "We become something different. You go be the person you need to be. I'll keep fighting the fights you can't stomach anymore. And maybe, years from now, Alexander will grow up in a kingdom worth living in because we both made different sacrifices. Vivienne squeezed his hand. I'm sorry. Don't be. Adrian let go and stepped back. Just promise me one thing. Anything. When you leave tonight, don't look back. Don't second guess. Don't let guilt turn this into a mistake. You're making the right choice, Vivienne. Trust that. Vivienne nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Then she turned and walked out of the chapel, leaving Adrian standing alone in the silence. And for the first time in 4 years, she felt like she could breathe. The Royal Unity celebration was everything Vivienne had expected. Opulent, orchestrated, designed to project power and stability. Buckingham Palace glittered with candles and crystal, the ballroom packed with nobles in their finest formal wear. Musicians played in the balcony, servers circulated with champagne and delicacies. The king himself sat on a raised dais, looking frail and distant, while Adrian stood beside him in full royal regalia. Vivienne entered wearing the white and gold gown, her head high, Alexander's hand clasped in hers. She had decided to bring him, let him see this world before she left it, let him understand what she was walking away from. He stared around in wonder, his eyes wide, and Vivienne felt a pang of guilt. He would never have this life now, never have the security of royal protection, the power that came with Adrian's name, but he would have her, fully. Not the cold strategist or the political weapon, but the mother who still remembered how to be gentle. That had to be enough. Lady Ravenshire, a voice said. Vivienne turned and found herself face to face with Cedric. He looked worse than the last time she had seen him, gaunt, hollow-eyed, his formal clothes hanging loose on a frame that had clearly lost weight. But there was something different in his expression. Not the defeated resignation from their last meeting, something harder, sharper, desperate. Your Grace, Vivienne said coolly, I didn't expect to see you here. I needed to speak with you. Cedric's eyes darted to Alexander, and something cracked in his face. Is that? Yes. Vivienne's voice was flat. Your son, the one you thought was a bastard. Cedric stared at Alexander like a man staring at a ghost. The boy looked back with open curiosity, no recognition, no connection. To him, Cedric was just another stranger in a room full of them. He looks like me, Cedric whispered. He has my heart. That's all that matters. Cedric flinched. Vivienne, I need to tell you something important. We have nothing to discuss. Please. Cedric's voice was urgent, almost frantic. I know what Adrian is planning to do tonight, and I know you're going to refuse him. Vivienne felt ice crawl up her spine. How do you know that? Because I know you. Cedric stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're not ruthless enough to marry for politics. You never were. It's why I loved you. It's why I destroyed you. And it's why you're about to make a catastrophic mistake. What are you talking about? Adrian needs this marriage to consolidate power. If you refuse him publicly, you don't just embarrass the crown prince. You destabilize the entire reform movement. Every lord we've been fighting will see weakness. They'll strike. And without Adrian's protection, they'll come after you. Let them. They'll come after Alexander. The words hit like a fist. Vivienne's hand tightened on her son's, her mind racing. She had considered the political fallout of refusing Adrian, had accepted that she would lose power and safety. But she hadn't considered that refusing might put a target on Alexander's back. Hadn't thought about the nobles who still saw her as the disgraced duchess, who would see her refusal as proof she was vulnerable, who would use her son as leverage to destroy what remained of the reform movement. You're lying, she said, but her voice wavered. I'm not. Cedric's eyes were intense, burning. I've spent 4 years watching these men, Vivienne. I know how they think. If you walk away from Adrian tonight, they'll see Alexander as a threat. The illegitimate son of a duke raised by a woman with too much influence. They'll manufacture scandals, challenge his legitimacy, make his life hell just to hurt you. So what do you suggest? That I marry Adrian anyway? No. Cedric's voice was sharp, decisive. I suggest you let me protect you. Vivienne stared at him. What? Marry me instead. Cedric said it like an order, not a request. Right now, tonight. In front of everyone, you've lost your mind. I've lost everything else. Cedric's hands were shaking. My money, my reputation, my future. The only thing I have left is my title. And that title can protect you and Alexander in ways Adrian's political alliance never could. A duke's wife has legal rights. A duke's son has inheritance protections. No one can challenge Alexander's legitimacy if I publicly claim him. Vivienne felt dizzy. You threw us into a storm. You tried to destroy me. And now you want me to marry you? Not for love. Cedric's voice was raw, honest. For survival. Yours and his. I'm offering you a way out that doesn't require you to become someone you hate. A way to keep Alexander safe without selling your soul to the crown. And what do you get out of this? A chance to fix the worst thing I've ever done. Cedric's eyes met hers, and Vivienne saw something she hadn't seen in 4 years. Genuine remorse. I can't undo throwing you out. I can't erase the lies I believed or the pain I caused. But I can make sure our son grows up protected. That's all I have left to offer. Vivienne looked down at Alexander, who was watching the exchange with wide, confused eyes. She thought about the future she had imagined. Quiet, simple, free from politics. But that future only worked if Alexander was safe. And if Cedric was right, if the nobles would come after her son the moment she refused Adrian, then that future was a fantasy. She had 3 choices. Marry Adrian and lose herself completely. Refuse Adrian and risk Alexander's safety. Or marry Cedric and live inside a lie for the rest of her life. All 3 options were poison. The question was which one would kill her slowest. I need time to think, she said. You don't have time. Cedric gestured toward the dais where Adrian was speaking with the king. He's going to propose in 10 minutes. You need to make a choice now. Vivienne's heart was racing, her mind spinning through variables and outcomes and consequences. This was what 4 years of survival had taught her, to calculate, strategize, think 3 moves ahead. But every calculation led to the same conclusion. There was no good choice, only different kinds of damage. And she was so tired of choosing between bad and worse. Tell me the truth, she said quietly. Do you still love me? Cedric hesitated. Then he said something that made Vivienne's chest crack open. I never stopped. I just didn't know how to love you without destroying you, and that made me hate you even more. The honesty of it was brutal. Vivienne looked at this man who had thrown her into a storm and spent 4 years drowning in regret, and she realized something that made her sick. He was right about one thing. She wasn't ruthless enough to marry for politics. She had survived 4 years of warfare, but she hadn't lost her capacity to feel. And feeling meant caring about consequences, caring about Alexander's future, caring about the kind of world she left behind. Adrian didn't have that weakness. He could make the hard choice, without hesitation, because he had already killed the part of himself that flinched. That's what made him untouchable. That's what made him a monster. And Vivienne didn't want to be a monster anymore. Fine, she said, the word tasting like ash. I'll do it. Cedric's eyes widened. You will? On one condition. Vivienne's voice was steel. You never touch me. You never demand anything from me except public appearances. This is a contract, Cedric, not a marriage, not a reconciliation, just protection. Agreed. And Alexander never knows the truth about what happened 4 years ago. As far as he's concerned, you're his father who made mistakes and wants to fix them, not the man who tried to kill his mother. Cedric's face went pale, but he nodded. Agreed. Then let's get this over with. What happened next would be remembered in England for decades. Adrian stood before the assembled nobles, the king at his side, and began the speech Vivienne had helped him write weeks ago. It was eloquent, powerful, designed to position him as the future of the monarchy, modern, just, committed to reform. The crowd listened in rapt attention, hanging on every word. And then Adrian turned to face Vivienne. Lady Vivien Ravenshire, he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. You have been my most trusted advisor for 4 years. You have helped me reshape this kingdom into something worthy of its people. And tonight, I wish to honor that partnership by asking you to stand beside me, not just as an advisor, but as... I'm afraid I must interrupt, Your Highness. The voice came from the edge of the crowd. Cedric stepped forward, moving through the stunned nobles like a man walking to his execution. He reached Vivienne's side and took her hand, his grip tight enough to hurt. Lady Ravenshire has already agreed to marry me, Cedric said, his voice steady. Tonight, immediately, with her son, our son, as witness. The ballroom erupted. Nobles shouted, gasped, turned to each other in shock. The king leaned forward on his throne, confused, and Adrian stood frozen, his carefully constructed plan disintegrating in real time. For 3 long seconds, Adrian said nothing. He just stared at Vivienne with an expression she couldn't read. Betrayal, maybe, or understanding, or both. Then he smiled, cold and sharp. Is this true, Lady Ravenshire? Vivienne met his eyes. She saw the question beneath the question, saw him asking if she was sure, if this was really what she wanted, if she understood what she was throwing away. And she answered it. Yes, Your Highness. She kept her voice steady. I have agreed to remarry the Duke of Ravenshire. I apologize for the poor timing. Poor timing. The understatement of the century. Vivienne had just humiliated the crown prince in front of every noble in England. She had rejected his proposal before he could even finish making it. She had chosen the man who threw her into a storm over the man who saved her from it. It was political suicide. It was also the first honest thing she had done in 4 years. Adrian's smile didn't waver, but something died in his eyes. Then I wish you both great happiness. He turned to address the room, his voice cutting through the chaos. Let it be known that Lady Ravenshire's service to the crown has been exemplary, and her personal choices are her own. The celebration will continue. It was a dismissal, a clean, efficient severing of their alliance. Adrian was giving her permission to leave, to disappear back into obscurity, to take Cedric and Alexander and fade from the political stage. He was letting her go. Vivienne felt tears burn her eyes, but she forced them back. She turned to Cedric, who looked like a man who had just survived a firing squad. Find us a priest, she said quietly. Cedric nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Vivienne stood there holding Alexander's hand, surrounded by whispering nobles and shocked faces, and waited for the rest of her life to begin. The wedding happened in a side chapel with 6 witnesses, a priest, 2 servants, and 3 nobles who looked like they couldn't decide if this was scandalous or romantic. Vivienne spoke her vows in a monotone, her hand cold in Cedric's. Alexander stood beside them, confused but trying to be brave, sensing that something important was happening even if he didn't understand what. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Cedric leaned in to kiss her, and Vivienne turned her head so his lips brushed her cheek instead of her mouth. This is a contract, she reminded him in a whisper. I know, Cedric whispered back, but thank you. Vivienne said nothing. She just turned and walked out of the chapel, her new husband and her son following behind, and tried not to think about the future she had just chosen. They left the palace through a side entrance, avoiding the main celebration. Cedric's carriage was waiting, simple and unadorned, nothing like the royal procession Vivienne could have had. She climbed inside, pulled Alexander onto her lap, and stared out the window as London rolled past. Where are we going? Alexander asked. Home, Vivienne said, to Ravenshire. The word tasted like ashes. 4 years ago, Ravenshire had been a prison. Now it was supposed to be sanctuary. Vivienne didn't know if she believed that, but she also didn't have anywhere else to go. Cedric sat across from her, silent and tense, his hands clasped between his knees. He looked like a man who had just won a prize he didn't know what to do with. What happens now? Vivienne asked quietly. We survived, Cedric said. That's all we've ever been good at. He was right, and maybe that was enough. Maybe survival was its own kind of victory, not glorious or triumphant, but real. Vivienne had spent 4 years trying to become untouchable, and all it had done was hollow her out. Now she was choosing something different, something smaller, something that didn't require her to be a weapon. She was choosing to be human again, even if it meant being married to the man who had tried to destroy her, even if it meant giving up power and safety and everything she had built, even if it meant living with the knowledge that she had just walked away from the one person who truly understood her. Alexander fell asleep against her chest, his breathing slow and steady. Vivienne held him close and watched the city disappear behind them, the lights fading into darkness. And she tried not to think about Adrian, standing alone in that ballroom, watching her leave. Tried not to wonder if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Tried not to hear the voice in her head whispering that she had traded one cage for another, and this time, she had walked into it willingly. The carriage rattled through the night, carrying Vivienne toward a future she couldn't see, with a man she didn't trust, and a choice she couldn't take back. And somewhere behind them, in a palace glittering with power and corruption, Adrian Blackthorne stood at a window and watched the carriage disappear into the dark. He didn't move, didn't call after her, didn't send guards to bring her back. He just stood there, his face expressionless, his hands clasped behind his back, and made a decision that would change everything. 2 days later, a messenger arrived at Ravenshire Castle with a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. Vivienne opened it in private, her hands shaking. Inside was a single line in Adrian's precise handwriting. "You made the wrong choice, and now I'm going to prove it." Vivienne stared at the words, ice flooding her veins, because she knew Adrian, knew how he thought, knew that when he said he was going to prove something, he didn't mean words or arguments. He meant war, and Vivienne had just chosen to face it without his protection. The storm she had survived 4 years ago had been an accident. This one was going to be deliberate. Adrian's war came in the form of silence. No armies marched on Ravenshire. No assassins crept through the shadows. No dramatic confrontations or public accusations. Just silence. The kind that hollowed out a person from the inside. The kind that made you realize you had been cut off from everything you thought was solid ground. Within a week of Vivienne's return to Ravenshire, every political contact she had cultivated vanished. Lords who had once sought her counsel suddenly had no memory of her existence. Reformists she had helped elevate stopped returning correspondence. Even the servants Adrian had placed in noble houses to feed her information disappeared, reassigned or dismissed without explanation. It was surgical, efficient, and absolute. Adrian was erasing her from the game piece by piece, proving exactly what he had warned her about 4 years ago. Power wasn't something you earned, it was something you were allowed to hold until someone stronger decided to take it away. Vivienne stood at the window of her old chambers in Ravenshire Castle, watching snow fall over the grounds where she had nearly died 4 years earlier, and felt the weight of her isolation like a physical thing pressing against her ribs. She had made a choice. She had chosen humanity over power, chosen Alexander's safety over her own ambition, chosen to believe that survival didn't require becoming a monster, and now she was paying the price. The question was whether the price was worth it. Cedric found her there an hour before dawn, standing motionless in the dark. He had been careful with her since they returned, keeping his distance, speaking only when necessary, honoring the contract they had made. But something in his posture tonight was different, tense, urgent. "We need to talk," he said. Vivienne didn't turn from the window. "About what?" "About the fact that Adrian is going to destroy us." Cedric moved closer, and Vivienne could hear the fear beneath his words. "I've been receiving letters, quiet threats, suggestions that my voting record might be scrutinized, that old financial irregularities might resurface, that Alexander's legitimacy could be questioned if I don't fall in line with the Crown's agenda." "Let him try." Vivienne's voice was hollow. "I'm done playing his games. You don't understand." Cedric's hand gripped her shoulder, forcing her to turn and face him. "This isn't a game anymore. Adrian isn't trying to manipulate you back into his orbit. He's trying to make an example of you, to show every other noble in England what happens when you choose personal loyalty over political alliance. Then let him make his example. I chose this, Cedric. I walked away knowing what it would cost. But did you know it would cost Alexander?" The words hit like a blade between the ribs. Vivienne went very still, her breath catching. "What are you talking about?" Cedric pulled a letter from his coat and handed it to her. "This arrived yesterday. It's from the College of Heralds. They're questioning Alexander's claim to the Ravenshire title, suggesting that without proper documentation of my paternity, without witnesses to corroborate the timeline of conception, the succession could be challenged." Vivienne's hand shook as she read the letter. The language was formal, bureaucratic, but the threat was clear. Adrian was going to use England's labyrinthine inheritance laws to strip Alexander of his birthright. Not immediately, not dramatically, just slowly, methodically, through legal channels that would drag on for years and cost a fortune to fight. It was brilliant. It was vicious. It was exactly the kind of move Adrian excelled at, hurting people in ways they couldn't defend against, using the system as a weapon, making cruelty look like justice, and Vivienne had no way to stop it. She sank into a chair, the letter falling from her hands. "I thought choosing to leave would protect him. I thought being your wife, having your name, would be enough. It would have been." Cedric's voice was bitter. If Adrian wasn't willing to burn the entire kingdom to prove a point. "But you humiliated him, Vivienne. In front of the king, in front of Parliament, in front of everyone who matters. Men like Adrian don't forgive that. They erase it. So what do we do?" Cedric was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made Vivienne's blood run cold. "We give him what he wants, which is You. Cedric's eyes were hard, resigned. He wants you broken. He wants you to come crawling back, admit that leaving was a mistake, beg for his protection. That's the only way this ends without Alexander losing everything. No. Vivienne, I said no. Vivienne stood, her voice shaking with fury. I will not go back to being Adrian's weapon. I will not teach my son that survival requires submission. I chose to leave because I couldn't live with what I was becoming. If going back is the only way to protect Alexander, then we find another way. There is no other way. Then we make one. Vivienne's mind was racing, sorting through options, discarding impossibilities, searching for leverage she no longer had. She had spent 4 years learning how power worked, how to dismantle enemies and build alliances and turn weakness into strength. But all of that required resources, contacts, information, political capital, things Adrian had systematically stripped away. She was fighting with empty hands. And then she remembered something Adrian had told her once, years ago, when she was still learning the game. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one with the most power. It's the one with nothing left to lose. Vivienne had lost everything, her political network, her influence, her future. The only things she had left were Alexander and the tattered remains of her integrity, which meant she had exactly 2 weapons, and she was going to use both. Vivienne spent 3 days writing, not letters, not political briefs, a confession. Every choice she had made over the past 4 years, every manipulation and betrayal and calculated cruelty laid out in brutal detail. She wrote about Ashford's execution, about the lives she had ruined to pass the Reform Act, about the way she had learned to smile while destroying people's careers. She wrote about becoming Adrian's protege, about the cost of survival, about the moment she realized she had turned into something her younger self would have called a monster. And then she wrote about why she left. Not because she was weak, not because she couldn't handle the pressure, but because she had looked at her son and realized that if she stayed, she would teach him that power mattered more than humanity, that winning justified any sacrifice, that becoming a weapon was the only way to be safe. She wrote about standing in that chapel, choosing Cedric over Adrian, knowing it was political suicide but doing it anyway because it was the first honest thing she had done in 4 years. She wrote about the cost of being human in a world that rewarded monsters. When she finished, she had 40 pages. Enough to destroy her own reputation completely. Enough to prove she was exactly the kind of person Adrian had spent 4 years creating, calculating, ruthless, willing to do terrible things in the name of justice. Enough to make her useless as a cautionary tale. Because if Vivienne exposed herself before Adrian could expose her, if she owned every dark choice she had made and explained exactly why she made them, then Adrian lost his leverage. He couldn't threaten her with revelations she had already revealed. He couldn't use her past against her if she had already laid it bare. And most importantly, he couldn't make an example of her if she turned herself into a different kind of lesson, one about recognizing when you've gone too far and choosing to stop. It was a gamble, a desperate, reckless gamble that might end with her completely destroyed, but it was the only move she had left. Vivienne sealed the confession in an envelope and addressed it to the London Times, England's most widely read newspaper. Then she wrote a second letter, shorter, more personal. This one was addressed to Adrian. You wanted to prove I made the wrong choice. So let me save you the trouble. I'm publishing everything, every choice I made under your guidance, every life I ruined, every manipulation and betrayal. I'm telling England exactly what I became in the name of reform. And I'm telling them why I chose to stop. You can still destroy me, Adrian, but you'll have to do it after I've already destroyed myself. And that won't prove anything except that you can't let go of someone who was never yours to begin with. She signed it simply, Vivienne. Then she sent both letters before she could change her mind. The confession published 3 days later, taking up 6 full pages of the London Times. England exploded. Nobles who had worked with Vivienne scrambled to distance themselves, claiming they had no idea she was capable of such tactics. Reformists she had helped called her a traitor to the movement. Conservative lords used her admission as proof that Adrian's entire agenda was built on corruption and manipulation. The king issued a statement expressing disappointment. Parliament launched an investigation, and Adrian said nothing. For 2 weeks, as the scandal consumed London, the Crown Prince remained silent. He didn't defend Vivienne, didn't condemn her. didn't acknowledge her confession at all. He just continued governing, attending parliament, making decisions, as if the woman who had been his closest advisor for 4 years had never existed. The silence was worse than any public denouncement, because it meant Adrian wasn't interested in punishment. He was interested in erasure. Vivienne watched it all happen from Ravenshire, reading newspapers that called her everything from a fallen heroine to a manipulative conspirator to a cautionary tale about the corruption of power. She watched her reputation disintegrate, watched allies she had spent years cultivating turn their backs, watched the political legacy she had built crumble into dust. And she felt nothing. Not relief, not regret, just a strange, hollow emptiness, like she had cut something vital out of herself and was still waiting to see if the wound would kill her. Cedric found her at the library one evening, surrounded by newspapers, her face pale and exhausted. He sat down across from her without a word, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. "Was it worth it?" he asked finally. "I don't know yet. Alexander asked me today why people are saying terrible things about his mother." Cedric's voice was quiet. "I told him you were brave, that you told the truth even though it hurt, that sometimes being a good person means admitting when you've done bad things." Vivienne felt tears burn her eyes. "What did he say?" "He said you were the bravest person he knew." "Same thing he's always said." That broke something in Vivienne. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Not the quiet, controlled crying she had mastered over 4 years of political warfare, but raw, ugly, desperate weeping. She cried for the woman she used to be, the woman who believed love and loyalty mattered. She cried for the woman she had become, cold and calculating and ruthless. And she cried for the woman she was trying to be now, caught somewhere between the two, not sure if either version was worth salvaging. Cedric moved to her side and, for the first time since their wedding, put his arms around her. Not as a husband, as someone who understood what it meant to destroy yourself and have to keep living in the ruins. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything, for the storm, for not believing you, for taking 4 years to realize I threw away the only person who ever loved me for who I was instead of what I represented." Vivienne pulled back and looked at him. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes haunted. He looked like a man who had spent 4 years in purgatory and finally accepted he might never leave. "I don't love you anymore," she said. "The truth was brutal but necessary. I don't know if I ever can again. Too much has happened. Too much has broken. I know." Cedric's voice was steady. "But I can still protect you. And Alexander. That's what I'm good at now. Not being a husband, just being a shield. Is that enough for you?" "It has to be." Cedric stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "Because the alternative is watching you and our son get destroyed by a man who can't accept that you chose something other than power. And I've already done enough damage to last several lifetimes." Vivienne stood and joined him at the window. Together they watched the sun set over Ravenshire, painting the snow gold and crimson, beautiful and cold and indifferent. "What happens now?" she asked. "We wait," Cedric said. "We wait and see if Adrian is satisfied with humiliation, or if he's going to push until one of us breaks completely. And if he pushes, then I do what I should have done 4 years ago." Cedric's jaw tightened. "I fight for my family." Adrian's response came exactly 3 weeks after Vivienne's confession published. Not a letter, not a public statement, a visit. He arrived at Ravenshire Castle without warning, just a small escort and a message delivered to the door. The Crown Prince requests an audience with Lady Ravenshire. Private. Immediately. Vivienne's first instinct was to refuse, but she knew that would only prolong the war, drag it out until Alexander was caught in the crossfire. So she agreed on one condition. Cedric would be present. Adrian accepted. They met in the same great hall where Cedric had cast Vivienne out 4 years ago, the room that had been the beginning of everything. Adrian stood near the fireplace, dressed simply, his face unreadable. Vivienne and Cedric stood together across from him, united not by love, but by necessity. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Adrian said, "That was well played." Vivienne didn't respond. The confession. Adrian's voice was neutral, almost admiring. "You turn my weapon against me. If I destroy you now, I look vindictive. If I defend you, I admit I created the system that corrupted you. Either way, you've neutralized my advantage. It's exactly the kind of move I would have made. I learned from the best." "Yes, you did." Adrian stepped closer. Which is why I came here to tell you in person. You won. Vivienne blinked. What? You made your point. You chose humanity over power, and you were willing to destroy yourself to prove it. That takes a kind of courage I don't have anymore. So I'm withdrawing the challenge to Alexander's legitimacy. He keeps the Ravenshire title. You keep your family. And I keep my distance. Why? Because you were right. Adrian's voice was quiet, honest. I did want to prove you made the wrong choice. I wanted to show you that leaving me meant losing everything. That power was the only thing that mattered. That sentiment was weakness. But watching you publish that confession, watching you own every terrible choice you made and then walk away from it anyway, it proved something I didn't want to admit. What? That I'm the one who made the wrong choice. Adrian's eyes were hard, unflinching. 4 years ago, I saved you because I saw someone worth saving. And then I spent 4 years turning you into a weapon because that's all I know how to do. I took someone who still believed in kindness and taught her to be ruthless. And when you finally chose to stop, I tried to destroy you for it. That's not strength, Vivienne. That's just fear. Fear of what? Of being alone. Adrian's voice cracked, just slightly. Of being the only monster left in the room. Of watching the one person who might have understood me choose a different path and realizing I can't follow. Vivienne felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just recognition. She was looking at a man who had sacrificed everything to hold a kingdom together, who had made himself into exactly the kind of person he needed to be to survive, and who had finally realized that survival without humanity was just a slower way to die. You could still choose differently, she said quietly. No. Adrian's smile was sad, resigned. I'm too far gone. I've made too many choices, burned too many bridges, turned into something I can't undo. But you're not. You still have time to be someone Alexander isn't ashamed of. Don't waste it trying to fix people like me. Is that why you came here? To give me permission to move on? I came here to tell you I'm sorry. Adrian's voice was steady, honest. For saving you. For shaping you. For trying to destroy you when you outgrew what I made you into. You deserved better than that. You deserved better than me. Cedric had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward. If you're done threatening my family, you can leave. Adrian turned to face him, and something cold entered his expression. You're the reason she's here, you know. If you hadn't thrown her into that storm, she never would have needed saving. She never would have become what I made her into. Everything that happened after that night is your fault. I know. Cedric's voice was flat. I live with it every day, but at least I'm trying to fix it. What are you doing except making the world colder? Adrian stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed, bitter and broken. You're right. That's all I'm good at. Making things colder. He turned back to Vivienne. Take care of yourself. And take care of Alexander. He deserves a better world than the one we built. Then build it, Vivienne said. You're the crown prince. You have more power than anyone in England. If you wanted to create something better, you could. No. Adrian's voice was final. I can only tear things down. Building requires hope, and I burned mine out years ago. But you still have yours. Use it. He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the vast hall. Then he paused without looking back. For what it's worth, I'm glad you survived me, even if it means I have to survive without you. Then he was gone, leaving Vivienne and Cedric standing in the firelight, the ghosts of 4 years swirling around them like smoke. Vivienne felt something inside her finally break open, not with pain, but with release. Adrian's war was over, not because she had won, but because he had chosen to stop fighting. And in that choice, she saw something she hadn't expected, proof that even monsters could recognize when they had gone too far. It didn't erase what he had done, didn't undo the corruption he had taught her, or the lives they had both destroyed in the name of justice. But it was a beginning, a small, fragile acknowledgement that power without humanity was just another kind of prison, and Vivienne was done living in prisons. The years that followed were quiet, not easy, not simple, but quiet in the way that comes after a storm, when the world is still broken, but no longer actively destroying itself. Vivienne withdrew completely from politics. She didn't attend parliament, didn't correspond with reformists, didn't involve herself in the governance battles that had consumed 4 years of her life. Instead, she focused on Ravenshire, not the duchy, but the people who lived on its lands. She funded schools, improved roads, established clinics. She learned the names of tenant farmers and their children, sat through harvest festivals, listened to complaints about bad crops and unfair taxes. She learned how to care about things smaller than kingdoms. Cedric kept his promise. He protected her and Alexander, used his title to shield them from political fallout, voted with the reformists when it mattered. But he didn't try to reclaim their marriage. They lived as colleagues, not spouses, respectful, distant, bound by contract and shared history, but nothing deeper. Some nights, Vivienne would catch him watching her with something that looked like longing, but he never acted on it, and gradually, the longing faded into resignation. Alexander grew into a boy who asked difficult questions and refused easy answers. He learned about his mother's past, not from gossips or newspapers, but from Vivienne herself. She told him everything, sparing no detail, explaining the choices she had made and why she regretted some of them. And when she finished, Alexander had looked at her with those serious eyes and said, "You're still the bravest person I know, because being brave isn't about never making mistakes. It's about admitting them." Vivienne had cried for an hour after that conversation. She also started writing, not confessions or political briefs, but something different. Essays about power and corruption, about the cost of survival, about what happens when you sacrifice your humanity to win and then have to figure out how to reclaim it. She published them under her own name, knowing they would draw criticism and mockery. And they did. But they also drew letters from women who had survived terrible men, from reformists struggling with moral compromises, from people who were trying to figure out how to be good in a world that rewarded cruelty. Vivienne answered every letter. It was small work, unglamorous work, the kind of thing that would never change England the way Adrian's reforms had, the way the political battles she had fought might have, but it changed individuals. And Vivienne was beginning to understand that sometimes changing one person's mind was more valuable than changing an entire system. Sometimes the revolution you needed was internal. 5 years after the Royal Unity celebration, Vivienne received an unexpected visitor. She was in the garden with Alexander, teaching him about medicinal herbs, when a servant announced that someone was at the gates. Someone who refused to give a name, but insisted Lady Ravenshire would want to see them. Vivienne's first thought was Adrian. But when she walked to the entrance, she found someone else entirely. Margaret, the physician who had nursed her back to health 5 years ago, stood in the courtyard. She looked older, more tired, but her eyes were still sharp and kind. "Lady Ravenshire," she said, "I hope I'm not intruding." Not at all. Vivienne embraced her, surprised by how much she had missed this woman. "What brings you to Ravenshire?" "A message." Margaret pulled an envelope from her coat. "From the Crown Prince." Vivienne's stomach tightened. She took the letter but didn't open it immediately. "How is he?" Margaret's expression softened. "Dying." The word hit like a physical blow. Vivienne stared at her. "What?" "Lung fever. He's been fighting it for months, but it's finally winning." Margaret's voice was gentle. "He asked me to bring you this. Said it was important you read it before he's gone." Vivienne's hands shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a single page, Adrian's handwriting more uneven than she remembered. "Vivienne, if you're reading this, I'm either dead or close enough that the distinction doesn't matter. I'm writing to tell you something I should have said 5 years ago. You were right about everything. Power without humanity is worthless. Survival without connection is just slow death. And teaching people to become weapons in the name of justice is just another form of tyranny. I've spent 5 years thinking about the night you left, trying to understand why it felt like losing everything when I had convinced myself I didn't need anyone. And I finally figured it out. You were the only person who ever made me feel human, not because you loved me. I don't think you ever did, not really, but because you reminded me that there was supposed to be a point to all of this, to the reforms, the battles, the sacrifices. I was supposed to be building a kingdom worth living in, but somewhere along the way, I forgot that a kingdom is just people. And you can't make people's lives better by treating them like chess pieces. I'm leaving everything to you, not my title, that goes to my cousin, poor bastard, but my network, my contacts, my resources, everything I built over 2 decades of ruthless governance. I'm giving it to you because I trust you to use it differently than I did. To remember that power is supposed to serve people, not the other way around. Do better than I did, Vivienne. Build the world I was too broken to create. And if Alexander ever asks about me, tell him I was a cautionary tale. A reminder that winning isn't the same as being right. Teach him to be better than us. A. Vivienne read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She thought about Adrian standing alone in that palace chapel 5 years ago, admitting he didn't know what to do. She thought about him visiting Ravenshire, telling her she had won, walking away because he knew he couldn't change. She thought about this man who had saved her life and then spent 4 years shaping her into a weapon because that was the only way he knew how to keep someone close. And she thought about the fact that he was dying alone, without anyone who loved him, because he had spent his entire life pushing people away in the name of strength. I need to go to London, she said. Margaret shook her head. He doesn't want you to. He was very clear about that. Said seeing you would make dying harder. I don't care what he wants. Vivienne's voice was firm. He saved my life once. The least I can do is be there when his ends. Vivienne arrived in London 3 days later to find the palace in mourning. Adrian had died the night before, quietly, with only Margaret and a handful of servants present. There had been no dramatic final words, no grand gestures. He had just closed his eyes and stopped breathing, the way people did when they were too tired to fight anymore. The funeral was enormous. Nobles from across England, foreign dignitaries, crowds of citizens who had benefited from his reforms. They called him a visionary, a revolutionary, a man who had reshaped England for the better. They praised his intelligence, his dedication, his unwavering commitment to justice. No one mentioned that he had died alone. No one mentioned that he had sacrificed every human connection in the pursuit of power. No one mentioned that winning had cost him everything worth having, except Vivienne. When they asked her to speak, she stood before the assembled crowd and told the truth. Not the sanitized version, not the political narrative, but the real story. She talked about the man who had saved her from a snowstorm and then taught her to be ruthless. She talked about the choices he had made, the people he had hurt, the way he had turned himself into a weapon because he believed that was the only way to fix a broken system. And she talked about the letter he had left her, the admission that power without humanity was worthless, the recognition that he had gone too far. She talked about the cost of winning when you've lost yourself in the process. The crowd was silent when she finished. Some looked uncomfortable, others angry, but a few, a small handful of younger nobles and reformists, looked thoughtful, like they were reconsidering the bargains they had made, the pieces of themselves they had sacrificed in the name of progress, like they were wondering if there might be a different way. After the funeral, Vivienne stood alone in front of Adrian's grave and made a promise. She would use his network, his resources, his legacy, but she would use them differently. She would build the kingdom he had tried to create, but she would do it without turning people into weapons. She would fight for reform, but she would remember that systems were made of individuals, and individuals needed compassion as much as they needed justice. She would do what Adrian couldn't. She would stay human. 10 years after the Royal Unity celebration, England had changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily, like water wearing away stone. Vivienne had used Adrian's network to fund schools, establish workers' rights, reform prisons. She had done it quietly, without seeking power or recognition, just methodically dismantling the systems that ground people into dust. Cedric had helped, using his position in Parliament to push legislation, to block corrupt appointments, to hold space for change. They were partners now, not in marriage, but in purpose. And that was enough. Alexander had grown into a young man who asked difficult questions and demanded honest answers. He studied law, spent summers working with tenant farmers, listened more than he spoke. People said he had his mother's intelligence and his father's discipline, but what they didn't say was that he had something neither of them possessed, the ability to see people as people instead of assets or obstacles. He was going to be a better Duke than Cedric had ever been. He was going to be a better person than Vivienne had been, and that was exactly what she had fought for. One evening, as Vivienne sat in the library reviewing proposals for a new education initiative, Cedric entered carrying a letter. He looked older now, gray threading through his hair, lines carved deep around his eyes. But there was something lighter in his expression than there had been 15 years ago, something that looked almost like peace. "This came for you," he said, handing her the envelope. Vivienne opened it and found an invitation. The new crown prince, Adrian's cousin, a moderate reformist with none of Adrian's ruthlessness, was hosting a gala to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Judiciary Reform Act. He was requesting Vivienne's presence as a guest of honor, acknowledging her role in shaping modern England. "Are you going to go?" Cedric asked. Vivienne thought about it. Thought about the woman she had been 10 years ago, desperate for recognition and power. Thought about the woman she had become 5 years ago, willing to destroy herself to escape the machine. Thought about the woman she was now, quieter, smaller, working in the spaces between grand gestures and political theater. "No," she said finally. "I don't need to be honored. I just need to keep working." Cedric smiled. "That's the right answer." He turned to leave, then paused. "Vivienne." "Yes?" "Thank you. For giving me a second chance, for letting me be part of Alexander's life, for not giving up on the possibility that people can change." Vivienne met his eyes. "We both changed, Cedric. We just did it differently." He nodded and left her alone with her work. Vivienne sat there in the quiet library, surrounded by books and proposals and letters from people she had helped, and felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years. Content, not happy. Happiness was for people who hadn't been through what she had been through, who hadn't seen what she had seen, who hadn't made the choices she had made. But contentment, that was something deeper. That was the knowledge that you had done your best with the tools you were given, that you had chosen the right path even when it cost you everything, that you had learned from your mistakes and were trying to be better. That was enough. Vivienne picked up her pen and went back to work, writing letters to farmers and teachers and reformists, building the kingdom Adrian had dreamed of and she had learned to create, one small choice at a time. Because that's what survival actually meant. Not becoming untouchable, not accumulating power, not winning at any cost. It meant staying human in a world that rewarded monsters. It meant choosing compassion when calculation was easier. It meant admitting when you were wrong and trying to fix it. It meant teaching the next generation to be better than you were. And it meant accepting that you would never be perfect, never be finished, never be free of the consequences of your choices. But you would keep trying anyway, because that's what it meant to be human. Epilogue. 20 years after the storm, Vivienne stood in the same spot where Cedric's guards had left her to die. She was older now, her dark hair shot through with silver, her face lined with years of hard work and harder choices. Alexander was married, running the duchy with the kind of wisdom that came from watching his parents navigate their mistakes. Cedric was retired, spending his days reading and corresponding with reformists, finally at peace with the man he had become. And Vivienne was here, standing in the snow, remembering the night she had nearly died. She thought about the woman she had been, naive, trusting, powerless. She thought about the woman she had become, cold, calculating, dangerous. And she thought about the woman she was now, scarred, flawed, but stubbornly committed to doing better. All three versions were her. All three versions mattered, and all three versions had been necessary to survive. Vivienne knelt in the snow and placed her hand on the frozen ground, feeling the cold seep through her gloves. She thought about Cedric, who had thrown her here out of pride and spent 20 years atoning for it. She thought about Adrian, who had saved her and then tried to turn her into a weapon and finally learned to let her go. She thought about all the people she had hurt and helped, destroyed and built, sacrificed and saved. And she forgave herself, not because she deserved it, not because the scales were balanced, but because carrying the weight of 15 years of mistakes was exhausting, and she was tired of letting the past define her future. She had survived Cedric's cruelty. She had survived Adrian's manipulation. She had survived her own darkness. Now it was time to survive forgiveness. Vivienne stood and turned back toward Ravenshire Castle, where lights glowed warm in the windows, and Alexander was probably reading to his children by the fire, where Cedric was likely asleep in his study, a book open on his lap, where servants moved through familiar routines, secure in their employment, safe in ways they hadn't been 20 years ago. It wasn't the future Vivienne had imagined when she was 22 and newly married, full of hope and love and trust in the goodness of the world, but it was a future she had built with her own scarred hands. And that made it worth every terrible choice, every sacrifice, every moment of darkness she had endured to get here. Vivienne walked back toward the castle, leaving her footprints in the snow behind her, a trail of where she had been, proof that she had survived, evidence that even the coldest storms eventually ended. And as she stepped through the door into warmth and light and the sound of her grandson's laughter, Vivienne finally understood what Adrian had been trying to tell her in that final letter. The greatest revenge wasn't hatred. It wasn't becoming untouchable or powerful or feared. The greatest revenge was surviving the people who tried to destroy you and building something beautiful out of the wreckage. The greatest revenge was becoming impossible to break, not because you were made of stone, but because you learned that breaking was part of being human, and humans, when they chose to, could always rebuild.